Hi, everyone. We'll just wait 1 minute to start and then we'll get going. It's great to see everyone. And a reminder that there will be no class next week during the Thanksgiving week. And our final class will be, I believe it's November 30th. That will be the last class of this series. Next November 29th, actually. It's the auspicious day that this whole month is devoted to. Next month, we have coming back from Israel, Alden Salavi on a Shabbat series. He was fabulous with this high holiday series, and it's a Shabbat series he'll be doing. I apologize, my nose is a bit stuffy. Hopefully the microphone and the headphones help with you hearing me. So we'll get started. Welcome to Stars and Stripes and the Stars of David. It's great to see everyone. I want to review for a second that let me just let in that I want to just review for a second what we talked about last week before we go forward to this week. So this month we're looking at what is going on both in the United States, and Britain plays into the equation, and also in British Mandate Palestine, the formation of the state, which leads to the UN vote of 1947 on November 29th. Next week, we will go to the days around the vote, both in the United States and in the Holy Land, and also go forward a little bit. But for last time we met, and this time, and as I said, for those who are just coming on, we take a break next week for Thanksgiving, and we'll conclude November 29th, the auspicious day itself. What has been shocking is how early in America there was Zionist encouragement, including John Adams. I don't know. Does anyone watch The Crown? Who's watching? Do you watch The Crown at all? Yeah. So I watch it. I lived in England. I used to see Princess Di taking her kids to nursery school. When I was in college, she was around the corner where the nursery school went, and knew a little bit, but am shocked at some of the things that they reveal in this series. I have to be honest with you. The same is true with digging in a little deeper into what was going on in America in particular. While we know some generalizations, some of the specific texts that we'll look at are honestly shocking, and how early and how potentially so many deaths could have been avoided during the Holocaust, and even after, in those potent years between 45 and 48. And like we learned last week, you have a British pastor an American pastor or pre-American pastor in the 17th century preaching for the Jews to return, and John Adams encouraging as well. That's a complex thing to want, because you're asking why necessarily are the Jews being encouraged to return to another land, and that's complicated. So what we're going to look at today is some concepts and texts that you may or may not have thought about and seen before, going from these early American beliefs to the more modern tension that existed in the American government, really from pre-World War I, about whether there should be a Jewish state or not, and this confusion between American support and lack of support for a Jewish state before and after World War II. And what we'll see today is a lack of policy after 1946, after events fell apart. We alluded to this last week, and we'll revisit this week, and the bombing of the King David Hotel that ultimately leads the British to a different path that's there. But before we do anything, what I want to do is there's 3 different underground divisions that are existing in British Mandate Palestine that are trying to in different ways fight the British, and are trying to make the British give up, and they all have different strategies. And so what I want to do it's just, we're not going to watch the whole video, but just give you a quick 2-minute first view of these three different Irgunim that were there. I mean, three different underground military groups. There was the Lehi, there was the Haganah, and then, can you hear me? Are my speakers correct? So, all right, I'm going to take this up. I have a call. Is that better? Is that better? Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, this call, I was trying to use the headphone. So these three different underground military groups, I just want to give you a short background. Even though they're located obviously in British Mandate Palestine, they figure prominently in our discussion today. So I'm going to just share quick 2 minutes of this video, which explains the three different underground. Just give me a heads up if you can see.
The Israeli army, there were actually three underground Jewish militias. Yeah, they were the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi. They all had competing ideologies, and sure, they fought common enemies like the British and the Arabs, but their fiercest enemies were often each other. Now, these fights between the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi weren't your family's Seder table squabbles. This was Jew against Jew with life and death consequences in the future Jewish state. By the way, we're talking about the period between the late 1930s and mid-1940s when Nazi Germany was taking over Europe and the number of Jewish victims continued to rise. But despite their disagreements, the Jews comprising these militias did all have something in common: Zionism. They were all desperate to achieve the dream of a Jewish state. Where they disagreed was on how to achieve the dream. So, who were these militias? Why did they briefly put aside their differences to join forces, and why did they ultimately disband? Now, to better understand the different powers in play prior to Israeli independence in 1948, let's briefly talk about Zionism, the movement to establish a Jewish state. Today, the word alone can send a room into a frenzy. That isn't a new phenomenon, even amongst fellow Zionists. But it's important to know that Zionism isn't and never has been monolithic. It has different flavors. Think of eating pizza. There's different ways to do it. You can pick it up, you can fold it, you can eat with a fork and knife, but at the end of the day, it's still eating pizza. So it's the same with Zionism. Different ideas, but still Zionism. But as an aside, if you eat pizza with a fork and knife, I think we need to talk. Anyway, these different strands of Zionism are what inspired the competing military factions we're going to talk about. We're gonna pick things up in the 1920s when we had Jews and Arabs living under British colonial control in modern-day Israel. Quick history lesson: what is now modern-day Israel was colonized by the British from 1923 to 1948. It was called the British Mandate of Palestine, or simply the British Mandate for our purposes. At the time, the mainstream strand of Zionism was socialist Zionism, whose followers believed that achieving a state would require working diplomatically with other countries, namely Great Britain. Sounds simple enough, right? David Ben-Gurion, the leader of mainstream Zionism and Israeli founding father, #NotJustAnAirport, and the overall establishment believed in this idea. But socialist Zionists were still realists and saw the value in having a military. So in 1921, in response to spreading Arab violence against Jews in the British Mandate, these social Zionists established the Haganah, an illegal underground army. I know, illegal underground army sounds pretty badass. But the Haganah was really established more out of necessity, simply to provide protection to Jewish settlements. It practiced a policy of havlaga, or restraint, and didn't go full paramilitary or launch attacks. A loose organization made up of local defense groups, Haganah leaders favored the long game of diplomacy with the British in hopes of eventually establishing a Jewish state. Fighters were instructed to only defend Jewish communities, not incite violence against the Arabs or the British. But some Haganah commanders protested this policy of restraint. I'm looking at you, Vladimir Jabotinsky. Basically, Jabotinsky, one of the Haganah's original leaders and founders, fathered a splinter movement from socialist Zionism known as revisionist Zionism that gained prominence in the latter half of the 1920s as Arab violence against the Jewish community picked up. Spurred on by Jabotinsky, these revisionist Zionists felt social Zionists were too weak and passive in the face of British rule and Arab oppression. After particularly bad bouts of Arab riots against Jewish settlements in 1929, 31, and 37, fed-up Haganah commanders, led by Jabotinsky, launched a rival militia called the Irgun, dedicated to armed struggle against the British and the Arabs. not too long after, the British implemented something called the White Paper of 1939, which dictated their official government policy in the British Mandate. 1939, something else important happened that year? Anyone? Only the Second World War broke out. So just when things were getting really, really bad for the Jews in Europe, right when they needed to get out the most, the White Paper strictly limited Jewish immigration to the British Mandate. In doing so, the White Paper only exacerbated the divide between the Haganah and the Irgun. Now, in theory, socialist and revisionist Zionists, the strands that made up the Haganah and the Irgun, weren't all that different. They actually agreed on quite a bit, including opposing everything about the White Paper. Both believed in the establishment of Jewish settlements in pre-state Israel, the right to a Jewish armed forces, and more Jewish immigration, all accomplished ideally through diplomacy with the British. But where they disagreed was to what degree they might be willing to use force, if need be, to achieve those goals. But what did that look like? Well, with the Second World War raging in Europe, Ben-Gurion and the establishment pledged support to the British in their fight against a common enemy, the Nazis. They still favored the path of diplomacy, although they voiced their displeasure with the British policies like the White Paper. The Irgun, on the other hand, sneered at the Haganah philosophy of restraint. They continued fighting the British despite the war effort, taking their marching orders directly from Jabotinsky and eventually Menachem Begin, who arrived in the early 1940s. They intimidated merchants, extorted money, and even blew up British immigration and tax offices. Ben-Gurion reviled the Irgun, referring to its members as a harmful, destructive gang. He feared Irgun-led revolt would bring down the wrath of the European power on Jews in the British Mandate. Think the Irgun sounds intense? Well, meet the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, and the third armed Zionist underground organization we'll talk about. Soon after the outbreak of the Second World War, the Irgun adopted a temporary truce with the British, essentially ending its violence against them. It was a move that, surprise, surprise, some Jews didn't like. So yet another splinter group took shape in 1940 when Abraham Stern, an Irgun commander, created the Lehi.
And we're going to stop there. And all these underground militias play out in this story in different ways. And I just think it's important to understand that. I think the other thing that's important to understand in it and kind of digging into this period of time is that you learn, and like this is not, unique to this time, but there are people in governments who are given powers to do things, and other people in the same governments who sabotage those things. And that really starts with the Balfour Declaration, because already, in 1917, Chaim Weizmann had been working to persuade the British government to allow for there to be a British homeland. And so with great joy, and, if you go around Israel, there are things named after Balfour. And we looked at this document last week. You have this document, the Balfour Declaration, that's on your screen, that gave Jews a lot of hope. Now, this is, 20 years before World War II breaks out. And if it had been followed, obviously things would have played out very differently. But the Balfour Declaration, while it existed and acknowledged the Majesty's favor of the establishment of a state in Palestine, where things really had gone awry in government is in a couple of different ways. Number one, the Arab nations and oil, right? That becomes a big issue for Britain. So while Jews were optimistic about the establishment of a homeland after the Balfour Declaration, and as increasing anti-Semitism arose in Germany with Nazi persecution, there was hope that there would be the establishment of a state. Part of the problem, though, is the state that the British and the American governments were trying to look at, both before and after World War II, in this British Mandate area. It was not a Jewish-controlled government, and that's where things kept falling apart, that no one wanted to come to the table, that the Arabs didn't want to come to the table if it was going to be a Jewish state. The Jews didn't want to come to the table if it was going to be a British-run state, and no one had autonomy. On top of that, in the land, as the people who are living there, the Arab communities that are living there, see that there are more Jews immigrating, right? Because they're prompted by this Balfour Declaration and increasing anti-Semitism, and they think that there is going to be the possibility of a state in Israel sooner rather than later. Even though, does anyone remember the ratio of who to 1? It was X to X, 95 to 1. For every 95 Jews that went to America, 1 went to British Mandate Palestine. So even though there was still a coming in to this British Mandate Palestine area, and that got the Arab nation, the Arab locals that were living here and the Arab nations around upset. And that's why these 3 underground militias developed. So Haganah, then Irgun, then Lehi, they're fighting because they're not being protected by, and they don't really have any protection because, as Britain becomes more sympathetic to their need to be able to get oil from the Arab nations, they're not necessarily feeling, fully all into protecting Jews against what's going on in especially these new established kibbutzim and moshavim, where there are, Arabs who've lived there that are attacking. On top of that, they're attacking the British. And of course, we'll get a little bit later to the most famous attack on the British that Menachem Begin, if you saw a picture of him earlier, was the greatest part of. The Jews were feeling betrayed and abandoned by United States policy that they felt was really losing support. And you have the complexity of Roosevelt as a president who appeared to be sympathetic to the Jewish cause, but would not intervene without with a full wholeheart into the establishment of a Jewish state. And there's a great, as I said last week, there's a great book, The Ark of a Covenant, and in that Mead talks about that Harry Truman never was gung-ho for a Jewish state. The actions that he took were reacting to other people wanting it to happen. And, Truman believed in Woodrow's, accepting of the Balfour Declaration and self-determination. And he initiated studies, but it was also with people coming to him. And as we'll see with the case of Henry Grady in a little bit, it was there was contention within his own government. And as we talked about last week, there's this Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry and Truman thinks that if American presidents think they have the ability to get a lot of power and things done around the world, and it doesn't always go their way, as many situations show. And there were 100,000 Jewish refugees that after World War II that Truman wanted the British to allow in 1946 into British Mandate Palestine. Now, Britain and America were still hoping for there to be a territory that was controlled, and it was Arab and Jewish, but Britain would control it. And Britain is not going to allow these 100,000 Jewish refugees who, mind you, survived the Holocaust. And we're going to look at some poetry that reflects this complexity. Can you imagine going through all you went through in the Holocaust and then, trying to get into the Holy Land and then, dying fighting that war? And that happened to a lot of people. And so what happens is Truman focuses on this guy whose name is Henry Grady. I'll share his picture in a second. And it's funny, as I guess I'm obsessed with The Crown. I've been sick, so I've had time to watch and catch up on the new season. And this could be like Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Honestly, it's so royal and regal. But this is an American diplomat. His name was Henry Grady. He was originally from California. He was a professor. And he became a diplomat for Truman. And he did work he started in Cyprus. After World War II, Cyprus is a very potent area. You have a lot of displaced persons camps there. It's a potent area of the country. And so Truman asked him in October of 45 to be a representative to the Allied Commission supervising elections in Greece because of the volatile situation with the Greek Civil War. Then Grady is appointed to work with British Deputy Prime Minister, and they come up with this Morrison-Grady plan, which is in this period of time where no one's happy with anything to do, but he is empowered by Truman to create this proposal for the solution of the Palestine problem that calls for the federalization, or to unite under a federal system, like there'd be a Britain overseeing body to bring under the jurisdiction of a federal government. So the central authority would be a British trusteeship, which Britain's very used to having territories over the world, though they're getting smaller and smaller, and even smaller with King Charles now. But this plan was not liked by Arabs or Jews for a variety of reasons. So this Morrison-Grady plan that Henry Grady worked on, this very dignified diplomat, was announced on July 31st, 1946. And there were so many different voices. Even Grady, who had a piece that wasn't published after his death, talked about like something needed to, like the Jews have such a history and something should have been done for them, but this plan didn't work. And this is all that same time when Britain won't accept 100,000 Jews that America felt that they should accept in British mandate Palestine. And then the craziest thing happens is that Truman, who appointed Grady to support the plan, then says he's against the plan. Why? Because of the American Jewish lobby, because they're not happy with this plan. So what I want to share with you is some documents from this 1946 time period, which ultimately leads to America having no policy. Like it's a very sad thing. You would think like from 45 to 48, like everyone's working hard to figure this out, but the opposite. After this confliction in Harry Truman's government, he actually like takes away support for Grady's plan, which he originally sent him to work on. So again, you have like a lot of subtlety and confusion. So I'm sharing some documents from, there's a great site called Jewish Virtual Library. It's an Israeli run site, so it's pretty, it's accurate from Israeli state of view. And I mean, just look at the title of the section. Truman advised not to endorse partition. And this is September 1946. So after April, where Britain says no, the 100,000, after July, where the Morrison-Grady plan is proposed. And then this memo for the president, which is just like crushing. Elaine, do you mind reading a little bit? So this is to Truman in September of 1946. So like the war has ended. All these Jews have no Europe to go back to. As we saw last week, Polish Jews who went back were killed by Poles who lived there. America's still not, letting in people in numbers. And some of these people want to go to the Jewish homeland. They feel like after the Holocaust, that's the only safe place for a Jew to be. And yet in Truman's government, which gets to Meade's point in his book, The Ark of the Covenant, it's not like Truman was gung-ho for the Jewish state. It was more a reactive thing. And he had been reactive to the Zionists who said, we don't like this Morrison-Grady plan. And then here are those in his government saying, don't listen to the Zionists. So Elaine, are you able to read what's on the screen? Is it large enough?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Thanks. Rabbi Wise. Stephen Wise, who's a very prominent Reform rabbi, is part of this. And don't forget, the American Jewish community was very complex itself, because a lot of, especially assimilated and wealthy American Jews, were not Zionists. They felt like, let it be, we're comfortable here, we're successful here, especially Western European Jews, as opposed to like my family, which are like the Eastern European, the schleppers who come, and they're like, they're more attached, and they were never used to being in high society. They were always in Eastern Europe treated poorly, while Western Jews in Western Europe, as we know from history, in cities like Vienna and Paris and others, were actually part of high society and science and academics and arts. And then what we learned from the World War II is that there was just something that was never going to make it okay. We were always going to be this wandering people. Sorry, Elaine, go ahead. Rabbi Wise.
Rabbi Wise and certain other Zionists are urging that you should issue at once a statement in favor of partition in Palestine. It is apparently the idea of certain relatively moderate elements among the Zionists that if the American government does this, the Jewish agency may be able to persuade the British government to accept partition as the basis for the present London talks on Palestine, thereby enabling the agency to participate in the talks with a view of working out an eventual settlement of the problem. These elements also hope that a statement of this kind will strengthen then against the more extreme and administration Zionists who insist on all of Palestine being converted into an independent Jewish.
So they already, I mean, it's right there, like that those people who want there to be a Jewish state are anti this, anti this. And there's just a at the end here, these four kind of points that are there. And so you see that the American government is working against this. And this is the 4 points that they come up to and what they advise Truman to do. And that's why after 46, there's not really a policy. And then we'll talk about the event that kind of moves things along. Go ahead, Elaine. Sorry. What number one?
Okay. We do not believe that any statement at all should be issued by this government during the course of the present conversations. Situation in London is very delicate, and without full knowledge of all the complicated elements in the situation, we might do more harm than good by intervening at this time. This is evidently the view of such observers on the spot as Secretary Burns and Ambassador Harriman. In this connection, you may wish to bear in mind the recommendation of Secretary Burns at the time the decision was taken not to take part in the British announcement of the Morrison-Grady proposals.
And Grady's his guy. Grady's Truman guy. I mean, that's like you're seeing it right there. This in the government, this conflict.
Okay. To the effect that you might wish to avoid making any further public statements with regard to Palestine, and specifically with regard to the 100,000 Jews for the time being. Ambassador Harriman also, in a recent telegram, expressed the view after talking to Prime Minister Attlee, Foreign Secretary Bevin, and other British officials that in these circumstances, we should not involve ourselves in the matter beyond the steps which we have already taken. Continue.
David, do you want to read number two? David Patrick? Here, I'm going to have you unmute. No? Okay. Steve, do you want to read number two? If we yield.
If we yield to the pressure of highly organized Zionist groups just now and make statements calculated to give support to their policies of the moment, we shall merely be encouraging them to make fresh demands and to apply pressure in the future whenever they conceive it to be in their interest for this government. To make further statements on their behalf in any event, we do not believe that without sacrificing the public interests, we shall be able to go far and fast enough in rendering them support to keep them satisfied very long. It seems to us that it would be wiser to make it clear to them now, in a most friendly manner, that the government itself must determine when it is in the interests of the United States to make a statement with regard to Palestine, and that in the present instance, the government is of the opinion that it is in the best interests of the United States, and for that matter, of the Zionists themselves, for it to remain silent.
It is so funny, not funny to read these things right now when there's so much talk about Jewish power and you celebrities, with these statements and non-celebrities, talking about the power that the Jewish people have. And that's one of the things Mead points out. If the Jews were so controlling of the world, all of this would have been done much earlier. I mean, the irony of reading these texts. Steve, will you read number 3, 2, and then Philip, if you'll read number 4.
Any statement by this government approving partition would mean that we had gone contrary to the recommendations both of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry and of the experts who drew up the Morrison-Grady scheme. This would undoubtedly give rise to the impression that we are adopting a policy on an important matter in order to satisfy a particular Zionist group.
And then Philip, do you want to read the last number 4? Oh, that's him. I thought he was sitting there. That's not him live. Okay, Sandy, do you want to read number 4? Are you able to unmute and read? No? Okay. We're not here. You got to unmute. If you can't do that, I can read number 4. That's fine. Sandy, we'll come back to you. That's okay. So number 4, the attitude of the Arab world toward the United States has become progressively hostile in the last few months. Our Joint Chiefs of Staff who feel that the United States has a vital security interest in the Middle East have urged that we take no action with regard to Palestine, which might orient the peoples of the entire area away from the Western powers. The Arabs have always been fundamentally opposed to the partition of Palestine, and their adverse reaction to a statement by us favoring that solution would be intensified by the knowledge that we've taken such a position only after it has been adhered to by certain Zionist leaders. So reaction to this is 46 in the government. And it reminds me of, if you saw David Fry speak at Temple last year, he was he'd been on 60 Minutes about the Ritchie boys. So the American military, the leadership had been very anti-Semitic until 1942. So you had all these German Jewish refugees who were not drafted into the American army because of the anti-Semitism in the army. Then once the leadership of the military changed, then someone said, oh, we should take these fluent German Jewish refugees who have, patriotism or draft them and then get them to interrogate German, POWs. And 60% of the secrets on the Western Front were gotten from these Ritchie boys, these German Jewish refugees who then became enlisted, then became interrogators, who then got secrets. It's like the same thing here. If America had committed, because it didn't matter what year there was going to be Jews in the Middle East, like they would always, there was never going to be pleasing the Arab countries. Like no matter what you did, I'm a stepmom, so this is my reality. No matter what I do, it's the wrong thing as a stepmom. Like there's just no right to do so. I might as well just do what makes me feel good at myself. Just imagine if America in 1946 or even 1939 had not worried about the Arab countries in the region, knowing that it didn't kind of matter what they were going to do, that there was always going to be this tension because they were Nazi sympathizers. There'd always been tension there and had committed to a Jewish state. How different Israel might have been stronger earlier. Israel, the Holocaust might have prevented. Again, it's a what if that you play with history, but it is shocking. This is not a document I'd seen before preparing for this class, and I don't know if any of you had seen this before. This is 46. So this basically kills the policy. There is no policy, and because the American Jewish community is in this complicated place where they're trying. This is when some of you are born soon after. You just want to be American. You don't want your parents and their accents to be written out. There's a whole thing I do about it in the 1950s, the rise of Chinese food and how Jews like it because it looks like European vegetables and all the trait is camouflage. Italian immigrants and Chinese immigrants are coming at the same time. And Jews just want to fit in. So you have all this stuff going on inside the Jewish community. And also you have all this going on in the American government. So like in 1946, after this whole back and forth with this vacuum, and then what happens in 1947, perhaps the most significant event is when Menachem Begin and his underground militia blow up the King David Hotel. So we're going to watch a short video about it. It's actually, I think it's a British newscast about that. And then we'll talk about that and how it turned event and changed events. Again, this is why I wanted to show you at the beginning the three different underground military, because it's important to understand the difference. And you'll see when we look at Stern's writing a little bit later, how nuanced it is both in the Jewish society in America, the Jewish society in British Mandate Palestine, and in the American government. So let me just share. Here we go. I'm going to share, and just let me know if you can hear the sound. This newscast from the bombing of the King David Hotel. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear sound. Can you hear sound? Thanks.
Jerusalem has long been the focal point of the still unsolved problem of Palestine. Although in times of comparative peace, Jews and Arabs live side by side and go about their business in the old city of Jerusalem with apparent calm, beneath the surface, bitter enmity has continued to smolder for years. This is the Wailing Wall, where many Jews have been offering special prayers following the latest outrage by terrorists. And these are scenes in the modern part of the city, contrasting vividly with the old Jerusalem. The King David Hotel itself. It was in the wing on the right of the picture that the terrorists placed their explosive. And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing. Nearly 50 others were injured. The Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun Tzvai Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing. Many arrests have been made. Leaders of the Jewish agency have expressed horror at the dastardly crime perpetrated by a gang of desperados. Mr. Attlee in the House of Commons declared, the British government will not be diverted by acts of violence in their search for a just and final solution of the Palestine problem. President Truman, condemning the wanton act of terrorism, added that America and Britain are conferring on steps to be taken to implement the report of the Anglo-American Palestine Committee. Undoubtedly, the people of Britain anxiously wait for the announcement of a policy which will prevent the loss of any more innocent lives.
I don't know if any of you, so we showed the Menachem Begin new documentary Upheaval a few months ago. It's fabulous. You can probably find it online. Begin himself, his whole life intersects with all this because he survived the Holocaust. He and his wife survived the Holocaust separately and reunited in Israel. And obviously, he was a big part of the Irgun. He and Ben Gurion had a lot of tension, and then he became a recluse at the end of his life. So his story, and that's, I'll get to that point in a minute. Like, you have real people whose lives are tied up with this, and you have people sitting in places of power that are making decisions for people that are just in this utter refugee place. So just unmute or call out if you have any questions. If I'm not calling on you, so I just wanted you to see that video before we talk about the events that happened there. So the Jewish, there was a lot of antagonism between the Irgun. Remember, the Haganah is more about cooperation and about protecting itself from the Arab rights. It actually, I don't know if you know the name Teddy Kollek. He was the mayor of Jerusalem for many years. It actually came out after he died that he was an informant to the British about the Irgun and about the Lehi, because everybody wanted peace, and they just wanted, the Haganah felt cooperation with the British would be the best path to peace, or Irgun and Lehi felt like more violence would be the best path to peace. And eventually, unfortunately, what happened, or fortunately, I guess, depending on how you look at it, it took this act of the bombing of the King David Hotel. So what was the King David Hotel? It's gorgeous. You might have seen the YMCA across the street if you've been on King David. This is where Hebrew Union College, the Reform Movement Rabbinical School, which so beautifully, I guess, timely, just dedicated its new area to walk up to the campus, which it had been working on for decades, literally, just this week, which is kind of nice conflagration of events. So the King David Hotel, very fancy, beautiful hotel, had been the site of the British Military Command and British criminal investigation. And it chose to target after British troops had invaded the Jewish agency and confiscated a large quantity of documents. And again, Teddy Kollek might have had a place in that. At that point, 2,500 Jews in the land were placed under arrest, and intelligence activities were being understood, especially in Arab countries. There was a lot that was going on. Then, now we're talking about in Poland in 1946, there's a massacre of 40 Jews in Poland that is reminding the world, and Jews in particular, that just because World War II is over doesn't mean Jews are safe. And so they planned this attack. Begin really wanted to avoid civilian casualties. And there were 3 phone calls that were made to the hotel, another to the French consulate and to the Palestine Post, all warning that the King David Hotel would be detonated so people could get out. The hotel switchboard was called by one of the Irgun members, Adina Nissan, 30 minutes before the explosion. These calls were received and ignored. And the British officials who were supposed to evacuate the building were quoted by Begin as saying, "We don't take orders from Jews." And the Irgun also, to give a warning, detonated a bomb nearby, which broke windows, but didn't cause people to leave the building. And it was intended, again, to encourage evacuation of the building. So when the bombs did explode, the casualty toll was high. 91 were killed, 45 injured, including 15 Jews. It was more people in the area where the bombing was and on the street area rather than in the hotel. In a contrast to the Arab attacks on the Jews, which had been hailed as heroic actions, there was a high critique of this bombing of the King David. Now, for decades, like things that come out after time, for decades, the British had denied that they had been warned. But in 1979, a member of the British Parliament introduced evidence that the Irgun had indeed issued a warning, a testimony of a British officer who had heard other officers joking about a Zionist threat to the headquarters. The officer who heard the conversation left and survived. And also Brigadier Dudley Sheridan Skelton, according to Lord Grenville Jenner, had also said there had been a warning. He left, but he saw that others were ignoring these warnings that were there. And so with this bombing, Britain is now anxious to rid itself of this problem. And so the UNSCOP is set up, the United Nations General Assembly, on the Committee to Palestine. And the UN forms this committee that will ultimately lead to that partition vote on November 29th that we will talk about next week. I want to share, does anyone have questions or comments? Because I want to move, as I said in the first class, there's head and there's heart here. And you can't ignore the role of providence or Goral or fate or destiny in this. Like, it's not like we're talking about nails and hammers. We're talking about people and history and a lot of emotion and a lot of tension. And so that all gets tied into this. So as I said in the first week, there's going to be head and there's going to be heart. So giving you a lot of head, things that happen, I want to go to the heart. But before I do that, I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments. Feel free to, if you do. And I just want to start by having us look at these 2 pictures side by side. So as I said on the left, as we looked at earlier, that's Henry Grady. And the very same time, and it's really remarkable, this is kind of a classic picture, but find out people in their concentration camp uniforms coming on these clandestine boats, trying to get into British Mandate Palestine. Often, they're the only survivors in their own family, and then coming to fight for the state and often dying. And just the same period of time. And this is like, on the left, the American diplomat, and on the right, what's happening to the Jew who's trying to get into the land. And that stark contrast that's there, that again, it's manipulative. I put these 2 pictures side by side, but it's really a reality that's there. And I don't know what those 2 pictures side by side elicit from you, but we're talking about the same period of time. And that's a real. On any day in the world, I could give you a picture from one place today and another picture from a different place today, and there's stark reality. But this is our history and our government and our place we live in, that complexity of what we're doing. So we want to look at a couple of poems that are there. First, we want to look at Aaron Ashman, who wrote this poem, Homeward, that was in honor of survivors who braved. We actually had this in the high holidays. If you were there for the martyrology, right on Yom Kippur afternoon, there was a little video of this poem as well. This is a poem about all those survivors who braved the hard voyage and then were put in these refugee camps in Cyprus if they were rejected from coming in to British Mandate Palestine. And a famous Israeli singer, Shoshana Damari, would come to the refugee camps in Cyprus. And we recounted this at the high holidays, this little girl who, again, these are survivors of the Holocaust, now in these refugees and camps in Cyprus, waiting to come to Israel. And after she sang this song, approached Damari with a bouquet of thorns in her hand and said, "Joe, we don't have flowers in this camp. When we come to Israel, I will give you a bouquet of flowers." And so just what's going on. So let me just share the poem here. Margaret, are you on still? Would you like to unmute and read Homeward by Damari? Are you somewhere where you can read? Go ahead.
Homeward by Aaron Ashman. From east and west and all the ends, from desert to rocks and depth of waters, hearts are burning, hands are stretched. Homeward, 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 homeward. What is gunfire, fear of jail, darkness of sea and the teeth of rocks, to the soul of a Jew imprisoned by magic light? Homeward. If I die on the wandering, straying boat and my body is thrown to the fearful abyss, it will still go on its own unique road. Homeward. With my head adorned with seaweed, eyes shut, hiding the fire, I will embrace the shore with a yelling silence. Homeward. And behold my image in the wandering cloud, and behold my image in the dying light of the day, and my voice will chase you inconsolable, unsettled. Homeward, homeward.
I mean, just the concept of homeward to a home you've never been to, right? Think about what it feels like. Like for me, when I go back to New York, it feels like home. When I go to Jerusalem, it feels like home. There are places when you come to the temple, hopefully it feels like home. This is finding home in a place because the home you had is gone, your family's gone, and what does homeward mean? And then oftentimes, even coming to the land, there's, a dying that happens that you don't make it, but at least you have a home. There was also, this is so painful to teach, but even within those Jews who were living in British Mandate Palestine, there was tension and elitism and some division even there. There's a term gachal, which is an acronym in Hebrew for Chutz La'aretz, which means recruitment from the diaspora. And the gachal, and we'll look at a poem by Natan Alterman, who's an amazing Israeli poet, about the gachal. The gachal were literally survivors, often the last left in their family, who were then recruited. They got into the land through these clandestine immigrations. They were drafted into the Haganah, and they were taught self-defense tactics by those who were already in the Haganah. The able-bodied among them were seen as recruits, and even in these European and Cyprus detention camps, there was some training that was going on. This is always a complexity, because even during World War II, there was a Jewish British brigade, which were Jews that were trained by the British to fight the Nazis. And at the same time, Ben Gurion's favorite quote, "Fight the British as if there's no Nazis, fight the Nazis as if there's no British." So you can't even just imagine the mental state of people who had gone through the horrors of the Holocaust, then come to fight here and often die. And the poem that we'll look at in a second is about one of these gachal, one of these raw recruits who are often sent to the front lines. They were thrust into battle with dire consequences, often unsung by those who had been. Remember, those Jews had been in this land for generations and generations, who this was truly home. And then you have people who had been through what they'd been through in the Holocaust, thrown into battle with these dire consequences. So it's also a hard part of our history, and kind of, two Jews, three opinions. That's what's going on here. A lot of tension. But Alterman writes this painful, beautiful tribute to the gachal, these recruits who then die in Israeli battle. So, Alex, I don't know if you're watching at a place where you can unmute and read if you want to.
I can, I'm here, I'm here.
Great.
I'm
I
here.
will, I'll share the poem, and I put another, again, just to tug at your heartstrings. So another kind of, image of these, just
Okay,
so, Jews, God knows what they've been through, them coming, to find hope here. Hagachal by
Okay.
Natan Alterman.
Okay. Off from the shaking boat's deck, he came down to the port quay. On the quay, the homeland was waiting in the shape of a military truck and a sergeant. It stamped his name, it threw his clothes into a bag, it made him take a terrible oath by the sound of the trickling rain. We saw him crawling or kneeling, standing in line with a plate in his hand, and we knew, without brother or friend, it is hard to fight the freedom war. This land did not yet give him neither friend nor a safe haven, not even some joy of the 1,000 we all received as a gift. No, just his life, sword rescued, was handed to him on the coast, but this very life by evening he handed back, falling for her.
I mean, this imagery of coming in to the land, being suited up and sent out to war and dying that night. Latrine, is one of these battle places. It's crushing, and it's no welcome wagon. It's not. I mean, you think about the state. Today you hear about Ole immigrants who, Nefesh B'Nefesh and other organizations that give money, and there's settlement, and there's people helping for Jews to settle, and then here you have this very different scene that's here, that's very complicated. Any reaction to not Alterman's poem? Alterman's one of the best Israeli poets out there, writing in Hebrew, and just this sadness. It's like a failure of our there's so many failures in this story of the creation of the state, including failures within the Jewish community itself, but and even failures in British Mandate Palestine. And I think that's the power and the pain at looking through this history. The last thing I want to do is just share a personal story. I don't know if anyone has traveled to Israel with Temple Bethel or on your own. There's a children's home that I was introduced to in Netanya. It's called Beit El Ezraki. I'll share the website, and I'll put it in the chat as well. It's an incredible place. So in Israel, neglected children and children who can't live at home is a complicated thing, because Israelis do not want Israeli children to be put up for adoption with the hopes that they might be taken out of the country, because they want them to stay in the land. So there are things that are called children's home that are all over the state. And one that I have a very close tie to, and which Temple Bethel has a close tie to, is a children's home called Beit El Ezraki. It's run by a man, Yehuda Cohen, and the story of Beit El Ezraki is here. There's an immigrant family who had deserted children in their neighborhood, and so they took them in and started a home, and then the home got more funding and got bigger and bigger. And then this incredible man, Yehuda Cohen, came. His parents had survived the Holocaust, went to British Mandate Palestine, then left, after the War of Independence. They felt like it was rough. They went to South America, and then they made Aliyah back because of all that was going on in South America towards the Jew. And Yehuda Cohen, who's a friend of mine, ultimately became the head of Beit El Ezraki. There's hundreds, over 200 children today, and these are children who are either abandoned because of drug abuse in the home, or neglect, or orphan. There's some Ethiopian children that are there, and he raises them. They are raised in these homes. You can visit. It's an incredible place to visit. When they go to the army, they come home to Beit El Ezraki. When they need weddings, he throws the weddings. He's the grandfather to these children. Parents, if they're able to visit, do visit. Like, if you've a drug addicted parent, there are supervised visits that are there, but he raises these kids. So one day I visit when I go to Israel. One day I'm sitting in his office, and I see a bust of two boys, and I was like, who is that? That statue of? He said, oh, those are my two brothers. I never knew. His own parents had been, both his mother and father had been married to other people. Both his mother and father had survived the Holocaust, but lost their spouses. And his father had lost two boys in the Holocaust. And then after the war, his mother and father found each other, married, and had Yehuda and his sister. And then Yehuda goes into this professionally saving Jewish children and has this bust in his office of these two brothers he never knew who died during the Holocaust. And I end sharing that story about Yehuda Cohen and Beit El Ezrahi, this incredible children's home, to show you like it doesn't end. Like there's transactive trauma that goes on from generation to generation that's here. And this story doesn't end in 47 or 48. It plays out till this very day. And I think, what's so complicated about what's going on in the world right now, and it's particularly in the United States, is that, there's triggers for us of like knowing and knowing more, because this is certainly a lot of, information that's new to a lot of us, of the neglect that existed that's there. I highly recommend, if you attended Jonathan Greenblatt and Dara Horn, you consider coming to the third in the anti-Semitism series, which is David Friedman, who is former ambassador to Israel. He's actually cousins with Susan Stallone, who is on our staff. And he's the reason that the embassy was moved from, the United States Embassy was moved from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. I'll share and put in the chat the details of his visit, because, whatever your politics are, it's really important to know that like all sides have had moments where they've been great to the Jews, and all sides have had moments when they have been not so great to the Jews. And that's why it's so important. And, this was Jonathan Greenblatt's messaging a few weeks ago. Like, you just got to stand up to yourself. If you don't, take action and be engaged and part of it yourself, you're just like someone driving a car and not having the hands on the wheel. Like, we need to put our hands on the wheel. And, never did I imagine when, planning this lunch and learn or bringing this anti-Semitism series, would this be so timely and in the news? And unfortunately, it is. That's there. So I'm really excited for our last class. We're skipping next week, so everyone have a happy Thanksgiving. Our last class on November 29th, the 75th anniversary of the UN vote. We're going to look at the days leading up to that UN vote. It was a very exciting time. Thanksgiving figures into things as well on the calendar. Snow and bad weather figures in, and it's just a very exciting and also painful time. And we'll look at Natan Alterman's famous poem, "The Silver Platter," which epitomizes that period of time as well. So we'll really feel like we're reliving that day in real time here for the lunch learn. Any closing comments or questions? Okay, well, thanks to Ron, our producer, helps us get on. Thanks to everyone who's been here, and have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you on the 29th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank